Colin Aldrich could never have foreseen this. Everything in his life seemed to be going very well. 6 months ago, he got a promotion at work and a decent raise. Celia's interior design business was picking up, and now she was making a significant contribution to their family income. The house they bought 2 years ago wasn't luxurious, but it was big enough for their needs and located in a good area. Recently, he and Celia had started talking about having children. So he wasn't expecting trouble when it came crashing down on him. Colin couldn't help but notice the unfamiliar car parked in front of his house, but its presence didn't worry him. However, he grew concerned when, after parking the car in the garage and entering the house, he saw Celia sitting in the living room with an unfamiliar man. As he entered the room, she immediately stood up, and Colin couldn't help but notice how slim and attractive she looked. It was only when he focused on her face that he realized how nervous she was. "Hello, darling." She greeted him. Then she gestured to the man still sitting on the couch. "Do you remember Vince Callahan?" she asked. "He's my client. I did renovation work in his office. You've met before." "Oh, yes, now I remember. Hello, Vince. Nice to see you again. What brings you here?" Vince threw a hesitant glance at Celia, and she cleared her throat. "Darn it. This is not easy at all," she said quietly. Then she took a deep breath, as if preparing for the upcoming ordeal, and added, "Darling, I have no other choice. I'm leaving you." Those words made no sense to him. "What did you say?" She sadly shook her head. "I know, it's shocking, but I've filed for divorce." Stumbling, he made it to the armchair across from the couch and sank heavily into it. Why? "We didn't want this to happen," she said regretfully, "but Vince and I fell in love with each other. We've been seeing each other for a while now, and we no longer want to hide our love." "You're having an affair?" Colin stupidly asked. She cast a quick glance at her lover. "We didn't plan this, but after some time, we just couldn't deny our feelings for each other. Anyway, I've already moved a bunch of my stuff into the car. I'll come back for the rest later." But, Colin stammered. She ignored his unclear protest and handed him an envelope, which he hadn't noticed before. "So, here are the papers and everything else. I try to be as fair as possible, but just so you know, I've already taken half of our savings. Anyway, you'll need to hire your own lawyer to review this agreement. If you have any issues, he or she can contact my lawyer. I've attached her business card to the notice." He silently took the envelope, still trying to grasp what was happening. As he fiddled with it in his hands, she returned to Vince and took his hand. He stood up, and the two of them headed towards the door together. "But why?" "What?" he started to say. "I've already explained this," she interrupted. She nodded to Vince, and he opened the front door. She turned around one last time. "So, I guess that's it."
"Colin, I'm truly sorry."
"I want you to know that this isn't because of you. It's because of me." Then they left, taking with them the happiness he had enjoyed for the past 8 years. Colin had always considered himself level-headed. When there was an emergency at work, he could always coolly and quickly analyze the problem before deciding on the next steps. Today, that ability had left him. Now his thoughts were chaotic, jumping from one to another, unable to focus on any of them. How could I not understand what was happening? Where can I find a good lawyer? How am I going to prepare for the meeting with Ferguson tomorrow morning? I wonder if Celia planned anything for dinner? How am I supposed to get through this at all? He thought. These and other thoughts raced through his mind again and again, swirling and repeating. Each one demanded attention until he finally grabbed his head with his hands, trying to stop them. In despair, he struggled to his feet and headed back to the bedroom. Stripping off his clothes, he left them lying where they fell, then crawled into bed in emotional exhaustion. Interestingly, he soon fell asleep and remained in bed until the next morning. When he woke up, the noise in his head subsided, but the evidence of his new life's reality surrounded him from all sides. He immediately realized Celia wasn't beside him, and as he went to get dressed, he found her part of the closet empty. Walking into the kitchen to brew coffee, it felt like his steps echoed in the empty house. Even when he looked out the window, the North Carolina morning seemed noticeably gloomier than usual. Vince Callahan woke up and found Celia staring at the ceiling, her hands clasped behind her head. "What are you thinking about, darling?" he asked. "I was thinking about Colin," she replied. "I hope he's okay." "He'll be fine," Vince dismissively replied. "I hope so," she said. "When we left, he looked like he was in shock. I feel somewhat sorry. I mean, he wasn't a bad husband. It just all became somewhat mundane, you know?" "Well, that won't happen with us," he promised. "You'll have plenty of excitement." With those words, he playfully nibbled her, then rolled on top of her and began kissing her passionately. "Oh, Vince." "Yes," she sighed. Memories of the passion from the previous night quickly returned. In the sensual bliss, any thoughts of Colin quickly dissipated. For most of the day, the envelope Celia had given him sat on Colin's desk in the office. Finally, he couldn't delay it any longer, opened it, and began reading the divorce petition and proposed financial settlement. Focusing on the dry legal language was difficult because he absolutely didn't want a divorce. What he wanted to do was bury his head on the desk and cry, but he didn't want anyone in the office to see him in such a state. After a few minutes, he stood up and slowly made his way down the corridor to his boss's office. This woman had hired him long ago, and he considered her his mentor. She looked up at him when he knocked on the door frame, then took a closer look. "Are you okay, Colin? You don't look well. Do you know the name of a good divorce lawyer?" he asked with a dejected expression. "Damn it, Colin, not you and Celia. Please sit down." With these words, the woman stood up, closed the door to her office, and then sat on a chair next to Colin, placing her hand on his forearm. "Tell me what happened," she asked, clearly concerned. This time, Colin didn't hide his tears. Meeting with the lawyer recommended by his boss, he regretted it. The man's advice was to simply accept what Celia had proposed and move on. "But I don't care how good her offer is," Colin protested. "Firstly, I don't want a divorce, and certainly don't want to pay her to leave me and live with some other man." "Listen, you need to think about this rationally," sighed the lawyer. "You can't force your wife to stay married to you if she wants to leave. And honestly, you probably wouldn't want her to stay if all you'd get is an unhappy wife. Regarding the financial aspect, you haven't had to look at it from my side of the table. All Celia, right? All she's asking is to divide your current assets. She's not even asking for alimony. Obviously, she plans to remarry once the divorce is final. Listen, I've seen wives go after their husband's retirement accounts, demand exorbitant alimony, and petition for the confiscation of most of the family assets, including the house. Your wife is being reasonable. Don't anger her and don't provoke retaliatory actions." "Maybe so," Colin stubbornly replied, "but the fact remains, I still don't want a divorce." The lawyer nodded, his tone becoming sympathetic. "Colin, listen, you don't need a family law consultation. First of all, I'm not good at it, and secondly, I charge much more than any marriage counselor. If you're not ready to sign the divorce agreement, my advice: find someone to help you deal with your emotions." When Colin told his boss about the meeting, she surprised him by handing him her business card. "I had a feeling this might be your reaction after our conversation. I think you should see Dr. Helmar. He's a psychologist specializing in marriage issues. Several of my friends have consulted with him, and they all spoke highly of him. Give it a try and see if he can help." During the third counseling session, Colin began to repeat his complaints until Dr. Helmar interrupted him. "Listen, Colin, let's be honest. You're stuck. All I'm trying to get you to do is metaphorically change directions. I'm sure you're familiar with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. People often mistakenly think these stages are distinct from one another, and you fall into that category as well. Listening to you, I've heard you describe all the stages except acceptance. This is completely natural for someone going through what you're experiencing. But you've also told me that you're a rational thinker, capable of understanding problems and finding solutions. That's what you need to do now. Set aside emotions so you can develop a strategy to move forward. You need to start thinking clearly and understand that Celia won't want to come back. Realize that there's no point in reconciliation if she doesn't want to be with you. Until you can accept the reality of these factors, over which, I might add, you have no control, you'll continue to be stuck. You need to solve the problem of life after Celia based on facts, just as you've done when facing other problems in the past. Colin sat quietly, reflecting on what the counselor had just said. He realized that much of the pain he was experiencing stemmed from how wildly and unexpectedly everything had happened. There was no warning, no signs that their marriage was in trouble. Just yesterday, he was a happy husband in marriage, and the next day, he had to get a divorce. The day before, he was sure Celia loved him, and the next, he found out she was sleeping with another man. How could he move forward when he didn't know what was real? How could he move on when he was filled with anger? The counselor calmly listened to Colin's outburst. Once Colin fell silent, Dr. Helmer asked, "Have you ever heard of Reinhold Niebuhr?" Colin shook his head no. He was a widely recognized theologian of the 20th century who composed a simple, effective prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. It's a prayer of serenity. I've heard of it. It's the serenity prayer of Alcoholics Anonymous. Right. Anyway, in my view, it simply and eloquently describes the stages of grief. That's what you need to aim for. Serenity, acceptance, and wisdom. Until you achieve that, you won't be able to move forward. When Colin left the session that day, Niebuhr's prayer continued to echo in his mind. Serenity, that's what he needed in his life. The question was, how to achieve it? What could he do to find peace? Pondering over this throughout the weekend, he settled on a plan of action. On Monday, Colin called his lawyer. "I'll agree to everything Celia asks for, if I can meet her face to face for half an hour." "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked. "I've seen such encounters go terribly wrong, and very few of them end up satisfying both sides in a divorce. It'll be different this time, I promise. Arrange the meeting." When Colin was led into Celia's lawyer's conference room, he was surprised to see Vince sitting next to her, holding her hand. In fact, this is even better, Colin thought. Now Vince and Celia can both hear this directly from me. Celia's lawyer gestured for him to start, and Colin cleared his throat. "Listen, Celia, this is as hard for me as it is for you. Things didn't turn out the way I wanted between us, but I think that's true for a lot of other things as well. In this case, what's done is done, and now it's time for me to move on. My lawyer said that you offered a fair settlement and advised me to accept it. Considering that I need to move forward, that's what I'll do." He took a pen from the table and boldly signed the agreement. As the couple on the other side of the table exchanged looks of relief, he added, "There's something else I want to say." The couple froze, fearing what might come next. "I understand that you plan to get married as soon as the divorce is finalized," Colin continued. "So, in the spirit of moving forward, allow me to wish you all the happiness in your marriage that you deserve." With these words, he walked around the table and shook hands with the astonished Vince. Then he leaned in, gave Celia a friendly hug, and kissed her on the cheek. As the two lovers watched in surprise, he turned and walked out of the room. They looked at each other. "What just happened?" Vince asked. Celia shook her head in astonishment. "I didn't expect that," then she smiled. "But it's wonderful. The last thing I would want is war between us every time we see him." After signing the divorce agreement, Colin had to sell the house they jointly owned. Celia wasn't interested because she had moved into Vince's house. Colin didn't have the means to buy out Celia's share, and even if he did, he realized that the house was too big for him and held too many memories. The good news was that the real estate market was on the rise, so selling the house wouldn't be a problem. The bad news was that over the 2 years since buying the house, its value hadn't increased much, even with the increased demand. But ultimately, Colin had enough for a down payment on a 2-bedroom condominium in a good residential complex. By the time the house was sold, his new apartment was purchased, and Colin had moved into it. The waiting period for the divorce was almost over. Colin learned from a friend that Vince and Celia had already sent out wedding invitations. Needless to say, Colin didn't receive an invitation, but he found out that the happy couple would be going on their honeymoon to the Caribbean. He made his plans accordingly. When the sun-kissed couple returned, Vince picked Celia up, preparing to carry her over the threshold. But upon entering, he noticed a card slipped under the door with the inscription, "Check the back terrace." Concerned, he set his young wife down, grabbed her hand, and hurried to the terrace. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, but when he turned in another direction, his eyes widened and he gasped. There gleamed a luxurious propane grill with 3 burners, connected and ready to use. He turned back to Celia. "Did you buy this for me? I've always wanted one like this, but they're so expensive." "No," she confessed. "I know nothing about it." Trying to understand the origin of this item, she noticed an envelope taped to the shiny stainless steel lid of the grill. Approaching, she removed it and opened it. After reading the card inside, she caught her breath. "I can't believe this. It's from Colin. It says here, 'Best wishes on your wedding.'" "Colin gave us this?" Vince asked incredulously. If this is what he meant by moving on, then all I can say is he's a better man than I am. This is an amazing gift. I can't wait to grill on it this summer. "I have to call and thank him," Celia said, as Vince checked out the grill's capabilities. When Colin picked up the phone, he heard a mix of surprise, gratitude, and even a slight sense of guilt in Celia's voice. "Colin, we just found your wedding gift. I can't believe you bought us this expensive grill. It's too much." Did Vince like it? Liked is an understatement. He's still out on the terrace, drooling. "Perfect. I was hoping he'd like it. But you shouldn't have done anything like this. We didn't even invite you to the wedding," Colin chuckled. "Come on. That would have been too weird. But I meant what I said. It's time for me to accept what happened and move on. The gift is my way of showing that's exactly what I'm doing. So, I hoped you and Vince would like it." When Celia returned to the veranda to tell Vince about it, he shook his head in surprise. "Like I said, he's a better man than I am. Anyway, how about I cook up a few burgers for dinner tonight, Mrs. Callahan?" As April turned into May, Celia and Vince started making plans to celebrate Mother's Day with Celia's mom. They decided to invite her to a nice restaurant, but when they proposed the idea to her, Celia's mom objected. "Mother's Day is chaos everywhere. I'd be happy if we celebrated here at SO." Plans were made for the newlyweds to bring a special dish of salmon and grilled vegetables, cooked on Vince's new favorite toy. On the way, Celia asked her husband, "Did you remember to buy flowers for Mom?" Slapping his forehead, Vince quickly turned off the highway and pulled into the parking lot of a regional grocery store chain. Soon, he returned with a dozen pink roses. "They've wilted a bit," he apologized to Celia, "but it's the thought that counts." Arriving and taking the dishes to the kitchen, Vince handed the roses to Celia's mother with Mother's Day wishes. "Thank you, Vince," she said to him. "I'll put them in a vase later." Then she suggested they serve themselves and take the plates to the dining room. "Your dad is starving," she whispered to her daughter. When the food was brought out, Celia couldn't help but notice the magnificent bouquet of flowers sitting in the middle of the dining table. "Mom, they're beautiful," she said. "Did Dad give them to you?" Her mother chuckled. "Dad? He told me I'm not his mother. Actually, Colin sent them to me. Aren't they beautiful?" "Colin?" "Exactly. It's very sweet of him," her mother said. Nodding, Celia noticed a fleeting frown on her new husband's face. Later that day, when the couple was at home, Celia took a few moments to herself and called Colin. "Why did you send that bouquet to my mother?" she asked. "Ah, so it was delivered on time. Did she like the flowers?" "Of course. She was delighted," Celia admitted. "They were beautiful. But why did you send them?" Colin sighed. "Your mother has always been very kind to me, and since many years ago when my mother passed away, I've always felt a special closeness to her. So I wanted to show my respect. I hope that wasn't a problem."
No, no.
"Not at all. Like I said, she was really grateful. It's just that I didn't expect it, that's all. Honestly, I really appreciate it too. Well, if I haven't made a mistake, I'd like to ask for a favor." Sure. What is it?" "It's a bit awkward to talk about, but I think it's time for me to get back into dating. He could almost hear her hesitation. Colin, I'd feel really awkward if you were trying to set me up on a date.
No, no.
Nothing like that. I just imagine inviting a date over to my apartment, and honestly, it's a mess right now, more like a disaster zone. Can I hire you for some remodeling? You've always had much better taste than me. This is unexpected. But of course, I think I can do that. I've just finished a big design project, so I'm free and can start right away. Can I come over next week and take a look at everything? Of course. Now, I work from home 3 days a week, so Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday would work for me. Great. I'll come over on Tuesday during the day. When Colin let her into his apartment the following Tuesday, Celia immediately understood what he had been talking about. All the walls were painted in a dingy white color, the carpet was worn and faded, and the furniture mostly consisted of what he had inherited from their former home. I can't see that we could choose from a variety of options here, she said to him after surveying the place. So maybe first decide on the style you prefer, he shrugged helplessly. Honestly, Celia, I'm not very knowledgeable about styles, color theory, and all that. He looked around uncertainly, then brightened. What I really want is for you to design a place that you would personally like. He gestured with his hands. I don't mean something feminine and pink. I definitely want it to look like a straight man lives here. But I also don't want it to look like a sports bar. He pointed towards her. Just a place that someone like you would appreciate. A place where a woman with good taste would feel comfortable. You're the only one I can trust with this. That's really flattering, Colin. Actually, I think I know exactly what you want. Let me go back to my studio and develop some sketches. Then, after preparing several options, I'll give you a call and we'll see what you choose. Perfect. Thank you, Celia. I really appreciate it. Over the next 2 months, Celia met with Colin almost once a week. They needed to choose a design plan, review and refine the proposed decor, and then oversee the renovation they had agreed upon. After that, she regularly brought him samples of fabrics, paints, and furniture photos for his approval. Colin was pleased with the progress, but not Vince. Do you really have to meet with him so often? He complained to his wife one evening when she returned after another visit to Colin's apartment. Oh, come on, dear. I meet with Colin no more frequently than with any other client of mine. And besides, I thought you were comfortable with him, especially after his wedding gift to us. I think he has truly put everything behind him, she reassured him. Maybe, but both of you have a shared past, and I can't help but wonder if he really has forgotten about you. But I've forgotten about him, and indeed, if you come with me to the bedroom, I'll show you just how completely I've forgotten about him. While Celia felt she had managed to calm Vince's jealousy, she feared that Colin's next request might reignite her husband's emotions. During one of her visits, he suddenly asked her, "Are you still part of the book club?" "Well, yes. We meet every other Saturday during the day. Why do you ask? Is the club only for women, or can men join too?" "I don't know. I don't think any man has ever approached us to join. Why, are you interested?" "Actually, yes. I've told you that I want to start dating again, but I really don't know what to talk about with a woman. Most of the girls I know aren't really into sports, so we probably don't have much in common. I guess if I knew more about the books my potential partner might read, it would at least give me something to start a conversation." "All right, I understand," she nodded. "Actually, that's quite thoughtful of you. How about this? At our next book club meeting, I'll inquire about your participation. If they're okay with it, I'll let you know, and you can join the next gathering. If not, I can at least inform you about which book we've chosen so you can read it on your own." "I really appreciate that, Celia. Of course, I'd prefer to participate in the discussion and hear what you ladies think about the book. But if my presence makes them uncomfortable, I'll familiarize myself with the book independently." When Celia brought up this topic in conversation with her book club friends, she was pleasantly surprised to find that they were enthusiastic about Colin joining their group. "If you don't feel uncomfortable with your ex-husband's presence, we'd like to hear a male perspective," they told her. Celia found it amusing that 2 unmarried ladies seemed to enthusiastically embrace Colin's offer to join. At the first meeting, Colin completely won over even those participants who had expressed doubts. Unlike a few ladies, Colin actually finished the book and was able to share some insightful conclusions. At the same time, he made sure not to dominate the discussion. Celia was relieved to see that Colin respected different opinions and repeatedly supported others in their conclusions. At the end of the discussion, everyone agreed that the experiment was a great success, and before leaving, everyone hugged Colin. Celia noted again that the single participants were particularly energetic in expressing their gratitude. Colin not only attended the next meeting, but also invited the group to hold their gathering in his recently renovated condominium. Upon arrival, the ladies spent the first half hour marveling at the decor, and Colin tirelessly emphasized that it was all thanks to Celia. As is customary, the host of the meeting provided snacks and drinks to the participants. Colin went all out, offering his guests several trays of appetizers and several bottles of Prosecco to set the right tone for the conversation. The ensuing book discussion might not have been particularly intellectual, but it was certainly lively. When it was time to leave, everyone dispersed with gratitude. One of the unmarried ladies, a pretty young redhead named Kelly, was so persistent in expressing her thanks that Celia had to invent a reason to pull Colin away from her. After everyone else had left, Celia stayed behind, offering to help Colin with the cleanup. He gratefully agreed. After the used plates and glasses were loaded into the dishwasher, he escorted her to the exit. Taking her hands in his, he thanked her for her help and for supporting his joining the group. "Actually, I should be thanking you," she shook her head. "Everyone had a great time, as you probably noticed, and I think you added a lot to our discussion. And thank you for all your compliments about the decor. It was really kind of you." "Always a pleasure," he replied. "And thank you for saving me from Kelly," he added mischievously. She tensed instantly. "You need to watch out for her, Colin. She's a sweet girl, but she's a bit young for you. And from what I've heard, she's a bit of a man-eater, if you catch my drift." He nodded knowingly, hiding some surprise at her reaction. "I need to head home now, and thanks again for everything." Celia smiled, leaned in to hug him, and kissed his cheek. Then she pulled back and looked at him attentively. "I feel like I'm seeing a whole different side of you, Colin, and I like it." She kissed his cheek again, then turned and walked away. When Vince learned about Celia's new member in her book club, he was visibly upset and demanded that she tell Colin not to come anymore. She, in turn, was clearly irritated. "I won't do anything like that," she countered. "The girls like him, and he's a great addition to our group. So stop pretending to be jealous, Vince. Nothing bad is happening, and you look silly acting like it is." Vince managed to keep his feelings to himself, but that night he felt a strong desire to reclaim his wife as his own. Their lovemaking was unusually energetic. Vince seemed determined to assert his dominance, skipping the foreplay. Celia understood what was happening and decided it was wiser not to protest. But she had to fake it to encourage Vince to climax faster. Afterward, she kissed him and thanked him, but once he fell asleep, she slipped out of bed and took an Advil tablet. The next morning, Vince shyly apologized for how he had treated her the night before, but she waved him off. "I wouldn't want it to be like that every time," she told him, "but sometimes it's nice to change things up." Feeling relieved, he went off to work with a light step. As soon as he left, her forced smile quickly vanished. Wearing a sundress, Celia discovered that she was still in pain from the previous night and took another tablet. After breakfast and taking it, she drove to her design studio to see what was planned for the next week. There she found that Colin's apartment rug had been delivered and immediately called him, offering to bring it over. Encouraged by his agreement, after checking her makeup, she headed to his place. Upon entering, she laid out the small rug in the designated spot. Colin praised her choice and then invited her to stay for a moment and have a cup of coffee with him. She readily agreed. However, as she plopped down on his new couch, she grimaced, and Colin immediately noticed. "What's wrong, Celia?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Nothing serious," she replied. "Vince was a bit aggressive with me last night, and I'm a bit sore, that's all." She couldn't help but notice the concerned expression on his face, which then turned into a determined look. Without saying a word, he pushed the coffee table away from the couch. Then he grabbed his new rug and laid it out in front of her. Placing a pillow in the middle, he gestured for her to lie down on the rug. She weakly protested at first but gave in when he insisted. As soon as she lay face down on the rug, propping her hips with the pillow, he straddled her and began massaging her neck, starting from the base of her skull. As his fingers glided and applied pressure, the tension began to leave her body, and she let out a satisfied groan. Then his hands moved to her shoulders, then along her spine, working on her broadest muscles. Soon Celia was purring like a contented cat as he kneaded her aching back muscles. She was almost ready to drift off to sleep when she felt him move lower, sliding his hands under her pelvic bones and lifting them slightly. The effect was impressive. The pain she felt there disappeared. After working on her thighs for a few minutes, he released them and brought his hands to her firm buttocks. She gasped as his hands squeezed and massaged her, but before she could protest, he moved lower again. Now he was massaging the back of her thighs, gently pressing with his thumbs on her calves. After a few minutes of this procedure, he moved to her feet, lifting them to remove her shoes and working on the soles and toes. "Oh my, Colin, this is divine. I'm turning into mush." He didn't say anything. Instead, he lowered her legs and began to slowly move upwards along her calves, first pressing on her Achilles tendons, then lightly trailing his fingertips along her skin. He smiled to himself, noticing her quickened breath. As his fingers moved higher above her knees, she felt the cool air on the back of her legs. She realized that he must have lifted her skirt that was getting in his way, but any quiet protest froze on her lips as he slowly moved further up. When he parted her legs and began to trace his fingers up and down the inner sides of her thighs, she let out a quiet moan. As his fingertips approached her panties, her hips began to move involuntarily. When he touched her lightly, they both realized how wet she had become. He was gentle and tender with her, and it felt like she had never felt so good before. After a few minutes, he rolled onto his back, and Celia, writhing, hugged him, laying her head on his chest. She started to say something but stopped herself, not daring to voice what she was thinking. Instead, she snuggled closer, reveling in the warmth of his body. Their quiet breathing was interrupted by Celia's phone ringing. At first, she ignored it, but then reluctantly pulled the phone out of her bag. Seeing who was calling, she straightened up and answered the call. "Hi, Vince, how are you? Sorry for missing your call, I was busy." "No, I'm free now." "Sure, lunch sounds tempting. Where shall we meet?" "All right, I'll be there in half an hour." "Love you." She turned and looked apologetically at Colin. "Sorry, I have to go." She hurried to the guest bathroom to freshen up as best she could. Returning, she headed for the door, but before leaving, she turned back to him. "We need to talk. I'll call you." Colin nodded understandingly, and she disappeared. During lunch, Vince again questioned her about where she had been and what she had been doing, and Celia simply reiterated her previous excuses. Eventually, he changed the subject. He felt like he noticed something different about her, but he couldn't figure out exactly what had changed. That night, he again wanted sex with her, ignoring her statement that she was too tired. She managed to take a shower at home after they returned, but she still feared that he might find some evidence of her infidelity. However, Colin was so gentle in their lovemaking that Vince didn't detect the slightest hint of her betrayal. Nevertheless, she felt relief when he finished and fell asleep. As for Celia, she lay awake for a long time, thinking about her morning with Colin. The next day, Colin was working on his computer in the home office when his mobile phone rang. Looking at the display, he wasn't surprised to see that Celia was calling. She pleaded for a meeting to talk, and he immediately invited her to come over. Disconnecting, he quickly finished the report he was working on, then composed a text message on another phone. Hearing the doorbell ring and confirming it was Celia, he pressed send on the phone. Opening the front door and letting Celia in, he saw a worried expression on her face. She stepped inside. He closed the door behind her, then turned and looked at her intently. "Colin, we need to talk about what happened yesterday," she started, but he pressed his fingers to her lips, silencing her. She looked at him in confusion until he stepped closer and replaced his fingers with his lips. "Oh God," she exclaimed before responding passionately to his kiss. As their tongues sought each other, he led her backward into his bedroom, unfastening her clothes along the way. By this time, she was already gasping and quickly began pulling off his knitted shirt, yanking it over his head and tossing it to the floor before hastily reaching for his belt. They undressed each other in a flash. Then Colin scooped Celia up in his arms and laid her on his bed. There was no slow buildup of excitement this time. Colin was unwilling to be patient, and Celia was already aroused when she found herself in his apartment. Their attraction immediately peaked. Now sex with Colin was more passionate. Vince was working at his desk when an anonymous text message came to his personal mobile. "If you want to find Celia, you should check Colin's bedroom," it read. "Who is this?" He typed, but received no reply. He would normally ignore a message from an unknown number, but this message heightened the paranoia he had been feeling for some time. Grabbing his car keys, he dashed to the office garage and sped off to Colin's house. Celia wasn't sure what she wanted when she came to Colin that morning, but right now, sex with Colin was the only thing that mattered to her. Vince roared into Colin's condominium parking lot. Spotting Celia's car, he screeched to a halt in front of the main entrance, not bothering to look for a parking spot. Jumping out of the car, he saw someone exiting the building and dashed through the open door before it could close. Bursting inside, he paused by the entrance to orient himself. Then he hurried up the stairs to the second floor, not wanting to risk the noise of the elevator alerting Colin and Celia. Emerging onto the landing, he hurried straight to Colin's apartment door. His first impulse was to shoulder check the door and burst inside, but as he reached for the doorknob, it turned readily in his hand. He forgot to lock the damn door. He exulted. Sneaking into the apartment, he stealthily made his way to the master bedroom. There were no doubts about where to go or what he would find there. From inside, Celia's moans and cries were clearly audible. As soon as he entered, she screamed, arching her back and trembling. Then, while he watched in agony, she collapsed onto Colin's chest. "What the hell, Celia?"
Vince roared.
"How could you do this to me, especially with him?" Shocked, she sharply turned her head to see the one person she most wanted to avoid. Vince stood there with obvious pain and anger, his fists clenched, tears streaming down his cheeks.
"No, Vince, no."
"You have to let me explain." She started, but Vince didn't listen. "There's nothing to explain. You cheating. You've broken my heart. I never want to see you again." With these words, he turned and, blindly staggering, left the bedroom, heading for the front door. "Wait, Vince, stop. You can't be serious. Just wait a second." Celia cried out desperately, hastily putting on clothes to follow her husband. Colin silently watched Celia leave. Then he dressed and returned to his office. Noticing the disposable phone he had left on the desk, he picked it up and threw it into the trash bin. "I don't think I'll be needing this anymore," he told himself. When the phone fell to the bottom of the bin, a message he had sent lit up on the screen. "If you want to find Celia, you should look into Colin's bedroom." He was still working when he was interrupted by a timid knock on the front door. Opening it, Celia entered, dragging a large-wheeled suitcase behind her. She turned to face him, and Colin saw that her eyes were red and makeup had streaked down her cheeks. "Vince kicked me out," she said, tears in her eyes. "How is he?" Colin asked. "He's a wreck," she replied. "Just a moment ago, he was shouting at me, and the next minute, he was sobbing uncontrollably. I could barely make out what he was saying. The only thing that was clear was that my appearance was killing him, and he wanted me gone as soon as possible." She shook her head. "I really worry about him, but I don't know what I can do." "I know that feeling," Colin nodded. Then her somber expression brightened. "But at least for now, you and I can be together. We don't need to hide what we feel for each other." She raised her hands to embrace him, but was halted by his reaction. "I don't think so," he said. She was not only embarrassed by his words, but even more so by his tone. "What are you saying?" she asked. "Actually, you're right, Celia. We don't need to hide our feelings anymore. And my feelings are such that I wouldn't take you back even if you were the last woman on earth. I'd be crazy to take back a cheater. No, a double cheater into my life." She was shocked by his outburst of anger, but quickly tried to regain the upper hand. "Maybe I cheated on Vince, but I did it to make up for my mistake of leaving you. Now that I'm back, I plan on spending the rest of my life showing you how loving and faithful I can be." "You're quite a piece of work," Colin chuckled. "You treat men like interchangeable parts. Get tired of one, switch to another. If the second option doesn't work out, no problem, just go back to the first." "This isn't fair, Colin. Besides, you wanted me. You seduced me." He nodded in sarcastic agreement. "Well, of course, I understand. All it takes is for some guy to be polite to you, give you a couple of compliments, maybe present a gift, and you'll drop your panties in no time." "No, it's not like that." "That's exactly how it is, and I have no doubt that if I took you back, the same thing would happen again." "Well, I have news for you, Celia. I've seen who you really are. As the song goes, we'll never be together again." He walked to the front door, forcefully opened it, and tossed her bag into the hallway. "Get out," he yelled. Tears streamed down her face, her breath catching between sobs. "Oh God, I can't believe this is happening. Where do I go?" He crossed his arms over his chest. "If you want my opinion, I'd recommend heading straight to hell." Shrinking before his anger, she staggered backward toward the door, and Colin quickly slammed it shut, making sure to bolt it this time. Then he walked to his couch and flopped onto it, feeling the adrenaline slowly leave his system. Beginning to relax, he started thinking about everything that had happened. "I wonder what Dr. Helmar would say about all this. After all, I followed at least some of his advice. I gained the wisdom to understand what I could change and the courage to make changes, even if it meant holding my nose sometimes. But I'll leave the acceptance part to Vince and Celia." He shook his head. "I don't think either of them will find peace easily. Vince will have to come to terms with being a cuckold about to get divorced. Celia will have to accept that she's a cheating, kicked out of her home, and soon to be divorced for the second time." He grimly smiled. "Maybe I should send them Dr. Helmar's business card." Satisfied, he looked around, admiring his refurbished apartment. Then he returned to his office and sat at his desk. As he did so, he noticed a business card with Kelly's name and number that he had saved. Handwritten on the back were the words, "Call me sometime." He nodded to himself. "I think I'm ready to do just that."